Once the United States gained independence, whether or not a presidential candidate had served in the military was very important to the country's population. Although the United States has not had a veteran in office since 2009, 68%, or 31 out of 45 presidents, served in the military. In this video, we'll be looking at the 5 U.S. presidents who served in the American Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant is likely one of the first names that would pop to mind when discussing presidents who served in the military. He is often credited with leading the Union to victory and ended the war as the highest-ranking man in the U.S. military. Grant had graduated from West Point in 1843 and entered the Army as a brevet second lieutenant. In 1846, the United States went to war with Mexico, and Grant was initially given a logistical role, but after multiple requests, he was eventually assigned a combat role. He first saw action at the Battle of Palo Alto, and throughout the war earned himself a reputation as a commendable and skilled soldier. Grant would later credit his time in the Mexican-American War as where he learned many of the skills that would lead him to victory in the Civil War. After the war, Grant spent some time stationed all across the United States and abroad, but eventually fell into alcoholism while stationed away from his wife and newborn son. Grant left the Army in 1854 and would spend the next 7 years impoverished and doing anything to get by. Despite his hardship, he always ensured his children were fed and worked extremely hard to achieve a better life. Just 6 days after rebel forces attacked Fort Sumter, despite his long hiatus, Grant was offered a captain position in the Union Army. He declined this offer as he hoped to receive a higher ranking position. In late April, Grant was made the military aide to Illinois Governor Richard Yates, and shortly thereafter was made a colonel and put in charge of the 21st Illinois Volunteer Regiment. In August of 1861, Major General John C. Fremont passed over multiple more experienced generals to assign Grant to the District of Southeastern Mississippi. As Confederate soldiers moved into western Kentucky, Grant moved his men into Kentucky to attempt to preserve Kentucky's neutrality. Grant was under strict orders not to attack any Confederate forces, but once President Lincoln removed Major General Fremont from command, Grant was given the green light to engage in battle. Grant first saw Civil War action at the Battle of Belmont. Initially, Union forces took the Confederate camp, but once reinforcements arrived, the Confederates forced a Union retreat. The Battle of Belmont was very messy, but gave Grant's troops experience and confidence that would aid them in future battles. After Union forces managed to capture more land to the southwest, Grant ordered an attack on Fort Donelson. The Union Army had miscalculated the amount of men stationed at Fort Donelson and faced heavy resistance as they tried to capture the fort. On February 15th, Confederate forces led by General Pillow launched a surprise attack on Union forces, and Grant and his men rushed to reach the battlefield to assist the Union boys under attack. Grant's men managed to block the roads, forcing Pillow's men to retreat into the fort. After this, General Pillow and Floyd fled, leaving 12,000 soldiers without proper authority. Grant demanded the immediate and unconditional surrender of all the remaining Confederate soldiers, and won the Union its first major victory of the war. Despite some of Grant's superiors claiming Grant acted without authorization, this victory earned Grant a promotion, as well as praise from the public. By April 1862, Grant's army was stationed at Pittsburgh Landing, where a surprise Confederate attack left Grant's army clumsily retreating. One Union line managed to hold off the Confederate attack as Grant attempted to organize his men. Eventually, the line fell, and the Confederates captured a Union division. By this point, however, Grant had had the time to organize and launched a counterattack the next day. The exhausted Confederates were forced to retreat, handing Grant another major victory. Despite Grant's impressive victory, the horrifying amount of casualties suffered under Grant worried many civilians, and some newspapers began calling Grant a butcher. Lincoln and the other Union officials, however, recognized his importance and kept him in command. Grant played a crucial role in the incredibly decisive Vicksburg and Chattanooga campaigns before being sent east in hopes of ending the war as soon as possible. President Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a role that at that time had only ever been held by George Washington. This promotion essentially handed Grant command of all Union forces. In May of 1864, Grant was assigned to the brutal Overland Campaign, where Grant would suffer heavy casualties in brutal battles such as Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, and Petersburg. The Union forces continued to capture Confederate troops and territory before General Lee and his troops were forced to flee from Grant's approaching army. As Union forces blocked Lee's escape route, Lee was forced to send Grant a letter promising surrender. Grant and Lee met at Appomattox and spoke like gentlemen, officially ending one of the most horrific periods of American history. Grant would spend the next several years in charge of the Army, working on Reconstruction as well as other issues abroad. He was unanimously nominated at the 1868 Republican National Convention and would go on to serve 2 terms as president. His time as president is often overshadowed by his incredible military career, but Grant did pass several civil rights bills that paved the way for further fairness and tolerance. Grant began the war as a civilian and ended the war commanding every American soldier in the country. He is remembered as one of America's greatest generals to ever serve. Rutherford B. Hayes. Before the war, Rutherford B. Hayes was practicing law in Cincinnati and had already begun to impress Republicans as he represented multiple escaped slaves seeking freedom who had fled from nearby Kentucky. At the outbreak of the war, Hayes initially saw the two sides as irreconcilable and believed the government should allow Southern states to secede. After Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, however, Hayes joined a volunteer company and was assigned to the 23rd Regiment of Ohio. Hayes was promoted to the rank of major and served alongside another future U.S. president, William McKinley. In July of 1861, Hayes and his regiment were sent to Western Virginia, today's West Virginia, and first saw the enemy in September. In September 1861, Hayes and his regiment encountered Confederate troops at Carnifex Ferry and drove the rebels out. Hayes' regiment then settled in for winter. By now, Hayes had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and led his men on many small raids before being called to northeastern Virginia to assist in the Second Battle of Bull Run. Hayes and his men arrived after the battle had ended, but assisted in attempting to cut off Lee's men as they marched towards Maryland. At the Battle of South Mountain, Hayes' regiment was at the forefront, and Hayes suffered a gunshot wound to the left arm. Hayes continued to fight, refusing immediate medical attention, but was eventually sent away to recover. By October, Hayes was ready for action again, and had now been promoted to colonel. Hayes would later fight in the Battle of Buffington Island and Cloyd's Mountain, before being moved eastward and assisting in the capture of Lexington, Virginia. He was then swiftly moved north as Confederate General Early was approaching Maryland. Early's army surprised Hayes and his men at Kernstown, where Hayes was grazed by a bullet and had a horse shot out while he was riding it. Hayes and his men were defeated and retreated north, but after some reorganization, won multiple smaller battles, slowly forcing Confederate forces back south. Hayes' final battle of the war was a Union victory at Cedar Creek, and Hayes and his men returned home once news of General Lee's surrender reached them. He would go on to serve in the House of Representatives as well as serving as governor of Ohio before being elected president in 1876 and taking office in 1877. Hayes' presidential win remains the closest election in American history, with Hayes beating out opponent Samuel J. Tilden by just 1 electoral vote. James A. Garfield. By the 1860s, James A. Garfield had proved himself to be a competent lawyer and politician, but had not served any time in the military. At the outbreak of the Civil War, however, Garfield eagerly wanted to join the Union Army, as he viewed the war as a holy crusade against the slave power. Initially, Ohio's governor requested Garfield stay in the state legislature rather than leave to enlist, but by August 1861, Garfield's requests were approved and he was assigned to the 42nd Ohio Infantry. In December of that year, the 42nd Ohio was sent to Kentucky to serve under General Buell's command. General Buell sent Garfield and the 42nd Ohio to eastern Kentucky with the goal of driving any Confederate troops out of the area. Garfield first met rebel troops in Paintsville, and Garfield strategically maneuvered his troops in a way that made the Confederate forces believe they were outnumbered, when in reality, the Union and rebel forces had similar numbers. The Confederates fled the town, and Garfield gave chase. The two sides met at Middle Creek, with Garfield's soldiers defeating the Confederates with minimal casualties. This would be the only battle of the war Garfield would personally command. After this battle, Garfield focused on eradicating any Confederates in the area and promised amnesty to any Confederate soldiers in eastern Kentucky who returned home and realigned their loyalty to the Union. Garfield and his men spent some time seeing very little action before finally arriving on the second day of battle to assist in the bloody Battle of Shiloh. In the summer of 1862, Garfield fell ill and had to return home to recover. He waited anxiously to be returned to action and was finally reassigned to military duty in early 1863. Garfield began his work as Chief of Staff to General Rosecrans, with his most notable moment during the assignment being the Battle of Chickamauga, which saw the Union lose the battle despite suffering fewer casualties. After the Union soldiers retreated, Garfield made a now legendary journey to scout the size of Confederate forces remaining, which gave General Rosecrans the insight to call for crucial reinforcements. While home on medical leave in 1862, Garfield had been elected to Congress and now had to make a decision on whether he would take his seat or continue his military career. Garfield wanted to remain in the Army, but was persuaded to take a seat by President Lincoln, as the Union was in desperate need of people with military experience to fill up political positions. Garfield would continue to work in American politics up until his election as president in 1880. Just 1 year later, he was fatally shot in a train station, making him the second U.S. president to die by assassination. Benjamin Harrison. Like many U.S. presidents, Benjamin Harrison practiced law before his political career and first entered politics as a reporter of the Indiana Supreme Court in 1858. As the Civil War began, Harrison wanted to help the war effort by serving, but worried about his ability to take care of his family if he was away. As the war continued to drag on, worrying most Northerners, Harrison met with Indiana's governor and offered his help any way he could. Governor Oliver Morton tasked Harrison with recruiting a new regiment, which Harrison swiftly did. Initially, Morton offered Harrison command of the Indiana 70th he had just recruited, but Harrison declined the offer as he had no previous military experience. Harrison was instead made a colonel and joined up with other Union troops in Kentucky. The 70th Indiana mostly guarded railroads and performed recon, but in 1864, Harrison was promoted and moved to a different regiment where he fought in the battles of Cassville, Kennesaw Mountain, Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, Nashville, and others. Harrison was personally commended by President Lincoln and General Sherman, and was known to be very popular among the soldiers he commanded. He would continue to serve in Indiana's politics until 1888, where he would beat incumbent Grover Cleveland to become president. William McKinley. William McKinley was only 18 years old when the Civil War began. He had previously worked for the Postal Service and as a teacher, but as a college dropout with no real direction, William McKinley was eager to enlist. McKinley was assigned to the 23rd Ohio Infantry, where he would begin a friendship with one of his officers, future President and at the time Major Rutherford B. Hayes. McKinley first saw action in September 1861 in what is today West Virginia, where his regiment drove back Confederate troops at Carnifex Ferry. McKinley assisted his regiment by working as a clerk and was promoted in the winter of 1861. McKinley and his regiment continued to engage in minor skirmishes before being called east to attempt to stop General Lee's march north. The 23rd Ohio suffered major casualties at the Battle of Antietam, and McKinley was fired upon heavily while bringing rations to the men on the front lines, but thankfully escaped unscathed. McKinley would continue to fight across the Northeast, with many close brushes with death. At the Battle of Berryville, McKinley had his horse shot out from under him, a particularly harrowing experience for the young man. By the end of the war, McKinley had received several promotions and earned the reputation of a talented soldier. Many of his fellow soldiers encouraged McKinley to remain in the Army, but McKinley opted to return to Ohio, where he would begin to practice law and eventually become President of the United States. Unfortunately, like Lincoln and Garfield, McKinley's presidency would come to a tragic end as he was fatally shot in 1901. From 1869 to 1901, only 2 men took office as President of the United States who did not serve in the Union Army. The experience these men had in fighting to keep the United States together seemed to make voters believe they could truly make positive changes in office, and many of these men did just that. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to leave a like, because that helps tremendously, and let me know in the comments if you would like to see a video about the service of all the presidents who fought in other wars.